The nationwide broad resistance against President Trump's agenda is growing measurably. We saw the No Kings protest with over 5 million people across 2,000 cities and towns, and the media covered it as it happened, which undercuts some of the other narrative in D.C. especially about a supposedly weakened or exhausted Trump resistance.
Demonstrators gathered in large cities and small towns from coast to coast to oppose President Trump's policies.
Demonstrations spotted in Phoenix, Raleigh, and West Palm Beach, just to name a few.
Accused the president of stepping into authoritarianism.
About 100 to 250,000 protesters have filled this street.
This was a historic day of protest in the U.S.
The opposition against him is big, deep, growing, confident, and increasingly unstoppable.
Growing and increasingly unstoppable, as Rachel put it. And that reflects something that we can measure. This is a big deal. It wasn't just a one-off or a one day, even though it was quite the historic turnout for a day. And if you get out of sort of the endless sort of political narrative thing and just look at, say, how papers and people on the ground saw it, major cities to small towns, this is front page. This was big. It happened in a way that really got that local traction as the lived experience of huge gatherings far outside of campaign season. Around the world, many look over at the United States and recognize this as huge civic action, something that in some countries is a more common and, frankly, sometimes more respected contemporary occurrence than it is here. And yet tonight, days later, here we are. Much of the political world has moved on. And the D.C. press, and again, like any grouping, there's caveats and exceptions, but a lot of the D.C. press viewed this as a 1 or 2 day story. But is it? These protests are ongoing. And if they're just a 1 or 2 day story, the premise would be that it's somehow routine. Thing happened, tell you about it the day of, day after, move on. But right now, I want to go through the evidence that states otherwise, that we are not witnessing some small or routine thing, but rather a gigantic awakening and ongoing effort to resist what are extreme, sometimes rare events coming out of Trump's White House. When I say rare, I mean seizing powers that no one's tried in a half century. Sending in the National Guard, no one's tried that without a governor's approval in 60 years. Telling the Supreme Court sometimes they might not follow things and then weeks later following it. We don't have that on the modern record, not since the Civil War. Now, if this isn't getting the right coverage, by which I mean accurate, it could partly be because the media landscape is changing. Much of the more modern new media spaces are on digital and podcast platforms, and they currently lean right. And that might be a space where the protests are not a week-long story, not something they're celebrating, maybe not something they even want to get into the day it happens. Now, a longtime media member and critic, The Guardian's Margaret Sullivan, who's worked as an ombudsman, thinks deeply about how the press works. Even before the protest, she wrote about how the media in D.C. and elsewhere sometimes ignores anti-Trump protests because the companies are afraid that prominent protest coverage will be criticized by the right as partisan. And they, the press, cannot bear that label. She also argues that not only is the problem of fear going on, which is ironically something that the protests are protesting about, right? You fear a government reaction, you fear the powerful right wing saying you're partisan, but that's what the protesters are saying. We should have free speech regardless of what they say. She also argues that there's a kind of capitalist catering that goes on when conservatives have the upper hand right now, and they did show improving numbers in the elections. Quote, corporate media decision makers are fearful of losing right-leaning readers and viewers, she argues. So that's some of the concern from a very experienced member of the press. She's worked at big outlets about what's happening. But honest press is supposed to be honest, not catering to a bottom line. And that takes us to another piece of this tonight. Because some of the same types of outlets looking at another protest movement that was smaller than this one thought it was more important, treated it as a long-term story, even with far smaller numbers than this past weekend. Any guesses out there? I can hear you in your living rooms. I'm talking about the right-wing Tea Party, which grew in response to Obama being elected and had people out in the streets and was treated by these same outlets I'm mentioning as a huge, big, important deal. It was treated as a political fact almost among many outlets and DC types that the Democrats and Obama himself, newly elected with a mandate, would have to take this seriously and respond to the concerns of this big protest movement. It was covered more than 1 or 2 days. And their turnout numbers were much lower than this past weekend, but many in the press thought the Tea Party was a game changer.
The media, all they're talking about, or strangely not talking about, are the Tea Parties. For the life of them, they can't figure out what these Tea Parties are.
Thousands of activists held rallies in cities across the country protesting big government.
Fox News covered these Tea Parties, and we were one of the only organizations to give it any publicity or PR.
A movement championed
Everything is big in Texas
by high-profile conservatives.
We watched Mary on Fox News with her, 12 protesters, and that's really where it started.
So what started as perhaps organic and then also had a lot of money from the Koch brothers and other things, got some momentum, but it also got a lot of air cover, a lot of national emphasis on the Tea Party. And it wasn't an isolated incident.
Here's Fox correspondent Griff Jenkins doing a live shot, and keep an eye on what his producer is doing. Now, call me old-fashioned. I don't think a producer should be whipping up the crowd. If Glenn Beck wants to be a cheerleader for conservative protests, fine. But what you just saw amounts to choreographing the story to get people hollering.
And people were hollering. But given that we have this actual recent comparison, the Trump era came after the Obama era, let's just look at the facts of those protests. Because at the time, the demonstrators numbered into the tens of thousands, according to a September 2009 account in the New York Times. Now, that's a big protest. I've been to cover protests. Sometimes a few thousand feels like a lot if they're packed in and loud. Tens of thousands is certainly big, and you can cover it. But where does that compare to 5 million people in one day this weekend? Indeed, at their height, the Tea Party estimates would still have you, and we checked this today, be 1/20th of what we saw just this weekend alone. 20 times the number of protests. And remember, unlike some of that Glenn Beck stuff, the No Kings rally, shout out to some of the organizers, best we can tell, was organized, but from the ground up. You did not see a Glenn Beck type on the left, let alone many elected Democrats actually taking the lead. Now, there's a broader history in this country, of course. Protests so large they could not be ignored. Consider back in the early 60s when MLK led the history-making March on Washington. And within months, there was polling that most Americans thought even a peaceful protest like that, and again, there was other controversies in that era, but even peaceful protests, mass demonstrations, would hurt the fight for racial equality. We mentioned that with a note of humility. The people then, like the people now, including me, the voice you're hearing, don't know what's going to happen. We could be wrong. They were wrong because they overwhelmingly thought it would hurt, and they were skeptical of getting out there. Today, we have millions of Americans mobilized in a way that is absolutely huge. Now, one Harvard study of the Tea Party showed that Republicans thought they were improving their voter turnout because the protests did bring in new people. And there's a long-running debate over whether that kind of energy ultimately was a precursor to the MAGA era, and a party that was once seen as back on its heels definitely got aggressive. Does any of this translate to the Democrats in the coming elections? We don't know. But apart from elections themselves, we are living through something that is as big as the people involved, and the narrators, whether they're on podcasts or traditional DC media, might be missing it, might be treating this as a 1 or 2 day thing that's not as big as the Tea Party when, if you check the numbers, at its height, it's 20 times the turnout and national movement of that sometimes very hyped Tea Party movement.